Good evening, everyone. Hopefully you can hear me okay. Those of you that are here, do me a huge favor. Let me know if you can hear me okay, if I need to increase the volume, lower the volume. Getting back into the live streaming game again, and made some equipment changes too, so I just want to make sure that everybody can hear me okay. I am not looking at actual numbers right now because I have a lot in front of me and a lot to go over. So if you could please share the stream. I know a lot of you have done so already on Truth Social, and I appreciate that. If you could also do it if you're on X, take the stream and email it to people that you know or text it to people that you know. That would greatly be appreciated and help me gain more of an audience. As I've said, I've been out of it for quite a while and getting back into live streaming again. I think a lot of you have seen my videos. I appreciate watching those, but want to start doing a lot more when it comes to live streaming because it is a lot of fun. I like interacting with people and hope to do it more frequently. So yeah, please definitely share the stream. Also, before we get into everything, wanted to let you know there are links in the description, both if you're on either Rumble or YouTube. You can follow me on different places, Odyssey, BitChute, Rumble, YouTube, of course. Probably Rumble is going to be the more of the popular place, I think, for mine. But YouTube, I mean, we have 46,000 plus subscribers on YouTube, but my content kind of gets a little shadow banned, and I'm trying to definitely build up the Rumble deal. And we're also on Telegram, Gab, and Substack. What I want to talk about is locals and Substack specifically. You can, and the links are in the description, you can join our community on Substack. I do a newsletter every Monday, and also on the locals, it's sort of like a Twitter X, but it's private, it's a community. So if you want some extra stuff that I don't put on Rumble, that I don't put on X, and I don't put on YouTube, you can subscribe there for free. And also on the Substack channel, you can subscribe there for free as well. There is going to be premium content eventually on those, but for the locals, I'm going to run a special. If you're the first 10 people to join the locals, I'm going to give you the locals premium content for free. So those of you who are watching, please go to my locals channel and sign up there. I want to get that community going as well. Okay, so tonight, what I want to talk about is, I don't know how many people know who Nick Fuentes is. And I've been following him for at least a couple of years now. He's a 26-year-old talking head, and he is very, very smart for his age. Unfortunately, he's been slandered by a number of people on the left and the right. And, one of the worst things that we can do as people is formulate an opinion on someone based on somebody else's judgment. And we're going to get into Pat Buchanan. I think a lot of the people that follow me, the audiences, knows who Pat Buchanan is. Pat Buchanan was a highly respected conservative back in the 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s. And Nick Fuentes is very similar to a modern Pat Buchanan. But unfortunately, Pat Buchanan had been attacked so much by neoconservatism that if you didn't really know who he was or didn't follow him, you would have thought that he was a bad guy. And it's a very similar thing to Nick Fuentes. And really what it boils down to is for me, at the very least, all I care about is the truth. That's all I care about. And I think when you start to follow people like a Pat Buchanan, I mean, it's obviously that, his his days were when my father was teaching me about conservatism, and we were talking about conservatives. And Nick will get into this stuff when we go through his video, because I think it's just unbelievably well done. But William F. Buckley Jr., all of these neoconservatives during the Cold War, highly respected conservatives. But, the unfortunate thing with Pat Buchanan is that Pat Buchanan was, because of the things that were said about him, I think people kind of disregarded him and thought of him as a bad person based on what others said about him. Now, fast forward to today, it's the same thing with Nick Fuentes. Nick Fuentes is being talked about by the ADL, SPLC, Southern Poverty Law Center, Anti-Defamation League, and Conservative Inc. as a whole. And I think what you need to do is you need to kind of separate yourself from, okay, who's really the ones that are telling the truth here? Because if you take somebody like Tucker Carlson and Candace Owens used to be a never Trumper. She hated Trump. She ran a blog that was anti-Trump. Said he had a small unit, said he has small hands, hoped that the Tea Partiers would pass away. And I'm kind of being nice about it. But then all of a sudden, when it became politically expedient for her, she became a conservative. And millions of, or hundreds of thousands of people, or if not more, follow her. Tucker Carlson, the same thing. And Nick Fuentes is going to get into this. Tucker Carlson, from back in the day, attacked Pat Buchanan in the same manner that he's attacking Nick Fuentes now. And so you're going to see these parallels between them. And Charlie Kirk is another one. Lots of people follow Charlie Kirk. I'm a huge opponent of Charlie Kirk. I can't stand Charlie Kirk. Main reason why I don't like him, he was a never Trumper. And I have video to show that he was a never Trumper. But again, when it became politically expedient for him to be in Trump's corner, then TPC USA, that's what it was about. It was about the money. And I think all of us that follow me, people that follow the same individuals and really want to get at the truth and really care about America first, care about, making this country a better place, saving the children, holding people accountable. You have to cut through who's telling the truth and who's not telling the truth. And that's why I've I've given up a lot to focus almost 100% of my time on this in order to, call of this stuff out and bring this stuff to people's attention. So we're going to go ahead and get into it, and I'm going to start playing the Nick Fuentes' video. And when I do, I'm going to do my best to not interrupt it as much as possible. But I am going to start kind of stopping it and kind of inserting what I know and all those kinds of things as a kind of a narrative as the best I can without being annoying. So let's go ahead and get into it here.
So first, before we dive into all of the information, I do want to do a quick recap of some of the things that I saw that led me to do this show. I'm going to show you 2 clips. Now, forgive me because they are a little bit long. One is 2 minutes, the other's 3 minutes. That doesn't sound long, but that's a good chunk of change for me to be sitting here watching the clips. But I want to play for you a couple of clips. These are compilations of clips that have been sourced from C-SPAN and various sources by sources like Paul Town, Uncommon Sense on Twitter. This is really a grassroots effort.
By the way, what I should do is premise this. Some people probably don't know, what this is all about. And what happened was Tucker Carlson, I mentioned it briefly. Tucker Carlson had always said about Pat Buchanan, because Pat Buchanan was critical of not only Israel, but he was critical of the Jewish lobby and Judaism as a whole. And I'm not taking sides or anything like that. You have to make your own decision. I'm just presenting what these people are saying. So I'm not trying to push anyone in a particular direction. But I think when you look at this and you see all of the evidence and what's talked about it in totality, you'll come to the conclusion that there are things that are going on that are much more complicated, much more important, that need to be focused on, that not a lot of people are going to necessarily understand. But in order to get to the bottom of what's going on in America right now, these are the things that have to be discussed and worked out. Now, Tucker Carlson got on with Candace Owens. I had told you that Candace Owens was a never Trumper, and now all of a sudden is conservative, and she did an interview with Nick Fuentes and basically ambushed him, treated him horribly, said horrible things throughout the entire thing. And one, I will do probably a locals live stream or recording based on just that interview alone off of YouTube and Rumble. But she teamed up with Tucker Carlson. Tucker Carlson and her were doing an interview, and Tucker Carlson basically told Candace Owens, or said to Candace Owens, that Nick Fuentes was a gay weirdo kid in his mother's basement, or his parents' basement, spewing all of this, wacky stuff. So once again, Tucker Carlson, just like what he did with Pat Buchanan back in the 90s, where Pat Buchanan was actually an important political figure, running for president in the primary against George H.W. Bush in the 92 election, is doing the same thing to Nick Fuentes. And without getting into giving away everything, but all this stuff has ties to CIA and intelligence, which will go way back to World War II, and talking about how the whole intelligence thing started. So this is very, very extended. There's a lot of things that are going on, very far in the past, all the way up till now. But what Nick Fuentes is doing is finally saying, I've had enough. You guys are attacking me. You're attacking me personally. If you're going to go ahead and do that, then we're going to go through everything and show the background where Tucker Carlson comes from and the lies that he's told related to intelligence. I've just told you about Candace Owens, but also Candace Owens has to be under that same control in order to essentially attack the character of someone who's actually telling the truth. So I just wanted to preface that, and I'll try not to interrupt as much as I just did right now.
Effort of a lot of people on Twitter that have scoured the internet for this information, and they were inspired to do this by the show last week. It raised some red flags, some alarm bells. They got inspired. They went out, they did the deep dive, and they found this information. Now, it was because of these clips that I did this show. The first one I'm going to show you is a composite of about a half dozen different clips going all the way back to the 1990s. Now, last week, when Tucker did his big attack on me with Candace Owens, the big lie that stood out to everybody, maybe the cause for everybody to give me a chance and listen to what I had to say, was this. He called me a lot of names. He said I'm a weird basement dweller, I'm gay, all these different things. He said I'm a bad faith actor, I'm trying to poison the well of the legitimate America First right with a toxic association. He compared me to David Duke. He said a lot of things. And these are all things that have been said about me before. All the different attacks. You've heard them, I've heard them, we've heard them for years. That's not new. And some people called it cowardly and dishonorable. Some people cheered it on, honestly. But the big thing that stuck out from his show last week is something that could not be ignored. It was a brazen and bald-faced lie. This is the central problem, and maybe the central thing that he said, which again was cause for people to give me some consideration and watch the show last week. He said with Candace, and I'm about to play the clip for you just now. He said with Candace that he did not know that his father was involved in the CIA until his father died. And his father died in March of 2025. earlier this year. Not only did he say that he did not know his father was involved with the CIA, he said he was actually shocked. He was shocked and surprised that he found out very late in his life. His father was appointed by Ronald Reagan in the late 1980s to work for the U.S. Information Agency, hand in glove with the CIA. And they were behind such things as the CIA covert backing of the Contras in Nicaragua. They were behind the propaganda surrounding Tiananmen Square in China in 1989. So his father was involved in some serious stuff. And Tucker says that he did not know, again, until just about a few months ago that his dad was involved in the CIA. Well, everybody really had the same thought, which is, I think I've heard Tucker say, though, in the past, that he knew his father was in the CIA. And it didn't take long for people to find the evidence. And so last week on Friday, we found the clip from last year. Tucker Carlson did a show with Sean Ryan, another former CIA officer. This was in June of last year. And Tucker said at that time, I knew my dad was in CIA. I knew he was in that world. And so everybody said, wait a minute, irrespective of my favorability towards Tucker or my antipathy towards Nick Fuentes, they said something's not right here. That's a bald-faced lie. You got caught. Last year he said he knew. This year he says he was surprised, shocked to find this information out in March. So which is it? Something is not right here. Something is out of place. And what's more, the logical next question is, why would he lie? Why would he lie in such a brazen way about something like this? This isn't your usual white lie. If Tucker himself applied for CIA, if his father was CIA royalty in broadcasting, and Tucker's an international broadcaster, this does raise legitimate questions. And if Tucker is not being forthcoming about this, but is instead lying or obfuscating or concealing, it invites an investigation. It says, what else are you lying about? If you lied that you didn't know your dad was CIA, are you lying that you are CIA or the extent of your cooperation with CIA? That was a natural question. But we did more digging over the course of the last week, and we found about half a dozen other clips that Tucker knew and said publicly that his father was involved in the CIA. So I'll play this compilation for you right now, and we're going to react to it. This is the first clip. It's about 2 minutes, and I'll play this right now. All of this has come to light over the course of the past week, and this is a big reason why I did this show. So here it is.
And he's attacking my dad as a CIA, his dad's in the CIA or whatever. And I'm like, well, that's no, untrue. Then my father dies, and I learn, actually, yeah, was involved in that world. I was completely shocked by it. So no one has to believe me, but that's just a fact.
Right.
This was in March of this year. And so when I applied to CIA, and I've taken a lot of crap, including from Putin, like, oh, you're from a CIA family. Well, yeah, obviously my father worked in conjunction with CIA. I mean, that's what that is. And I tried to join the CIA.
He had a bunch of them. He ran the Voice of America for a long time, maybe 5 or 6 years. He was an ambassador in Africa, and then he ran something called the Corporation for Public Broadcasting.
I mean, the guy who took out Mossadegh lived on my street. One of the Roosevelt CIA officer. So, I mean, again, I grew up around this stuff, but
that's why it's not happening.
But they seem to be doing so many other things. I mean, I applied to CIA. My dad worked with CIA. I was never against CIA. I thought only like dumb liberals were against CIA, and traitors or whatever. So my views on CIA have evolved based on things that I have seen and personally experienced.
You took a pretty well publicized trip with your father. Was it about 1.5 years ago? How long has it been?
Since we were in Pakistan?
Down to Nicaragua for the summer and work and, get involved in the war, and support the side that we thought.
By the way, when he talks about being on that side, there's pictures of him with automatic weapons with 2 other friends of his in Nicaragua, if that tells you anything. How does somebody in his 20s, that young, how are they in there with that kind of weaponry during that time? That has to tell you something in the types of connections he has there.
That was right.
Where you got left behind for a couple of days.
Oh, no, that was when I went to Vietnam with John McCain. Yeah, I had a hassle at the airport.
John McCain went to Vietnam with John McCain too.
We spent the summer in Nicaragua trying to get a sense of the war there, and all kinds of hilarity ensued. But yourself, my father's a great guy.
I love that fake laugh.
Very amusing and adventurous person who's up for anything. So I said, let's go to Pakistan. Okay.
And we have the internet to expose the lies. If this isn't 20 years ago when you were on CNN.
Yeah.
There's another Ruben.
We can expose.
There's another anti-Trumper. Used to be a liberal too.
Well, I guess I would ask myself, like, I mean, I lie. If I'm really cornered or something, I lie. I try never to lie on TV. I just don't, I don't like lying. I certainly do it, out of weakness or whatever.
Can't get any more clear than that.
Okay. So that's 2.5 minutes almost of Tucker Carlson over the course of 20 years talking about and getting caught at least in 2, maybe 3 explicit instances saying, my dad was in the CIA. We lived down the street from the CIA officer that overthrew Mossadegh in Iran in 1953. I went to Vietnam with John McCain. I traveled to Pakistan with my father. I traveled to Nicaragua with my friends at the behest of my father. All these different clips paint a very interesting picture. 25 years. Going back to 1999, Tucker is saying, I was traveling internationally with my dad, who was in this world, that voice of America. And if you pay attention, he says in the Sean Ryan interview, he said, my dad ran Voice of America. That's what that is, the CIA. 2001, 2002, he says, my dad's at Voice of America. He's an ambassador from Seychelles, which is a major hub of the super mob. If you know anything about Seychelles, it's an island off the coast of Africa. And so I saw this compilation of clips and I said, something's not right. This is clearly a deep mystery here. Obviously, I was onto something on my show last week. Then another clip came to light. A second clip, if you will, or a second theme. If these are a compilation of clips, there was another major clip that caught my attention. We watched it on Monday. I was going to do this show on Monday, but I had to do a little more research. And in this clip, the second clip that I want to play for you, Tucker Carlson attacks Patrick Buchanan. Now, for those that don't know, Patrick Buchanan was an advisor to the Republican presidents Richard Nixon and Ronald Reagan in the 70s and in the 1980s. He became one of the most popular conservatives in America. He was a very famous commentator, pundit. He was on very popular talk shows. In 1990, he was in the middle of a major scandal because of his opposition to the war in Iraq. George H.W. Bush, former head of the CIA, vice president under Ronald Reagan, member of the Skull and Bones Society at Yale, George H.W. Bush took...
By the way, that is also important. What Nick is doing here is establishing not only a pattern of behavior, but he's also establishing a pattern of where these guys came from. They all came from Yale. They all came from either Yale or Yale Law School. He's going to get into recruitment to the CIA. And then later on down the road, he gets into how all of this stuff is interconnected.
Took us to war in Iraq in 1990. Many people believe at the behest of the Israelis. This was after the neocon ascendancy of the 1970s and 1980s, which we'll get into. George H.W. Bush takes us to war against Israel's archenemy, Iraq. Patrick Buchanan, who was, again, a very famous columnist and pundit at the time, he ran afoul of many of the Jewish neocons and the conservative movement at large at the time. He said the only people that want a war in Iraq are the Israelis and their amen corner in Washington who will agree with them on anything. For this, he was called an anti-Semite. He was canceled. He was banished from the conservative movement. He ran unsuccessfully for the presidency in 1992, 1996, and then again in 2000. Now, Patrick Buchanan was America First before America First. The title of this show. Patrick Buchanan was against the first war in Iraq before there were opponents of the second war in Iraq or opponents of the war in Iran. The situation in the 1990s, you could argue, was in many ways identical to what's happening in the conservative movement today. You had constituent elements of the conservative movement that were very skeptical of foreign intervention, very skeptical of going to war, particularly in the Middle East. At the same time, there were other factions inside the conservative movement that sought to cancel those people, who called them isolationists, anti-Semites, and undertook actions to get those people fired from their jobs, suppressed, get their careers destroyed, so that they could continue to advocate for wars in the Middle East that benefit Israel. Patrick Buchanan emerged as probably the leader of that former category of conservatives, of the social conservatives, the remnant of the old right in America that said after the end of the Cold War, why are we racing into the Middle East to fight another war for Israel? And for that, he was attacked. Now, this was a seminal moment because in many ways it prefigured the current arrangement. Just as it was then, so it is now. You have many constituent elements of the right wing that for one reason or another are coming out against the war in Syria, the war in Iran, calling for withdrawal from Iraq. And just as it was then, you have another element inside the right wing that is suppressing them, canceling them, trying to brand them as anti-Semites and isolationists. And just as it was then, you have a figure that has emerged, or a number of figures. I count myself among them. Perhaps you could say Tucker Carlson is one too, who are speaking out against the wars and
I would
against
not.
the neocons, this faction.
This is where I disagree with Nick on this. If you know Tucker Carlson, not know him personally, but know his career, he started out at MSNBC and CNN. So I mentioned earlier before we started all of this that there are people who were previously anti-Trumpers like Candace Owens and Rubin, who we just saw was a liberal, and Charlie Kirk and Glenn Beck, et cetera, that all of a sudden became in the Trump camp. So for him to say that Tucker Carlson is the same as Nick Fuentes or anybody else, I strongly disagree with that, because Tucker Carlson, and Nick will kind of prove this when he gets into the connections with intelligence, Tucker Carlson sort of goes with the wind. Whatever's popular, that's where he goes. And it's the same with Conservative Inc. as a whole. Like Glenn Beck and Blaze Media and Salem Media. All these multi-million-dollar, and in some cases billion-dollar conglomerate news organizations that so many conservative people listen to and watch. They sort of go with whatever's popular because that's where the money is. But also where what Nick Fuentes is talking about is where, what is more popular for Israel, for the Israel lobby, etc. So, I mean, Nick is right about a lot of things, but I think when he says that, I think he's trying to. Nick unfortunately tries to be nice to these people, but I think what's happening is he's continuously getting kicked by these people, and finally he's saying, I've had enough. But he still is trying to be polite because he's a young kid, and of course he doesn't want to be the a-hole. But at some point, he has to get a little bit tougher on these people, call them out for who they are.
In the conservative movement that are pushing those wars. But 25 years ago, Tucker Carlson took a very aggressive line towards Pat Buchanan, the leader of America First in the 1990s. When all of the neocons, when others were attacking him, Tucker Carlson joined that chorus.
Z-Rabbit is a good question. Why did Tucker lie about his father being in the CIA? Fuentes is going to get into this. And the connections going so far back to Pat Buchanan and the original neoconservatives, when you go all the way back to World War II, the OSS that transferred it to the CIA and everybody that was involved in that, you'll sort of understand why Tucker Carlson most likely lied about it. Is it was a cover to basically say I didn't know, I had no idea. But when you start talking about it, it makes it more obvious. Like, oh, my father was in the CIA, so more likely I'm in the CIA too, because it is generational. You know, if your dad was in it, you were probably in it. And so what he's trying to do is throw you off the scent. That's what he's trying to do. But it's like, look, it's the internet. You can't throw people off. I mean, it's there for everybody to see. So I think the main reason why is, and it gets into Israel, but it gets into not just simply Israel, but it gets into in the Israel lobby, but it gets into Judaism itself, which is where the real crux of this whole thing lies.
And called Pat Buchanan an anti-Semite and a nut. And his attack against Buchanan then is almost identical to his attack against me last week. I'll play that clip for you now. As I said, it's about 3 minutes, so bear with me. But it's important to watch the whole thing from start to finish.
I mean, this is part of the sad thing about Pat Buchanan, as far as I'm concerned. And just to restate, I mean, Pat does raise issues that I think are important. I mean, I think that, the sovereignty of the American military, et cetera, I mean, these are not just crank issues. But unfortunately, Pat Buchanan raises them in a way that I think is discredited. And when attacked, he can always fall back on the line, well, the tiny cabal that controls American politics doesn't like me because I speak truth to power. This is actually, incidentally, almost verbatim what he said the other day, that I offend the plutocracy, that I'm a wanted man by the inside the Beltway people, and in every sense cast himself as a victim who is sort of a Karen Silkwood of politics, someone who's so truthful that he's being hunted down by...
And those that don't understand the Karen Silkwood thing, this was a woman who, and I don't know why he brought this up, it's kind of a weird way of comparing things, but Karen Silkwood was someone who was an employee at a nuclear power plant, was exposed to nuclear waste, and was blowing the whistle on the company that was running the nuclear power plant, and was chased down allegedly by someone to try and kill her, drove her car into a wall, killed her so she couldn't, continue to go after this company. So it's kind of a strange thing that Tucker Carlson even knows that, and that he's even bringing up Karen's, Silkwood, and then how that kind of comes into play with this whole thing, other than, when you're getting into like nuclear contamination, which is government, and then somebody murders her. It was strange when I heard him say this.
By the conspiracy that runs Washington. I mean, it's all a bit much. Maybe Pat Buchanan just says things that are kind of kooky, and that's why he's being criticized. It's perfectly valid to question America's relationship with Israel. Israel has a lobby. It's perfectly fair, as far as I'm concerned, to beat up on Israel's lobby. But I don't think that's the reason that Buchanan is being labeled an anti-Semite. It's this kind of, as I've said, this relentless bringing up topics related to Judaism. I mean, famously, Pat, always beats up on Goldman Sachs, but never Morgan Stanley. I mean, it's really hard to... There is no point at which Pat Buchanan has held a press conference and said, I really don't like the Jews. I think they're a sinister force in America. But I think, and it took me years to come to this position. I mean, I'm not throwing the term anti-Semite around. But you reach a point when you say, well, gee, here's a guy who has gone out of his way to defend Demjanjuk and other accused Nazi war criminals, who's constantly attacked Israel, who's attacked American Jews for supporting Israel unduly, who's implied that American Jews push America into wars in which non-Jews die. There really is, and again, I'm not hysterical on this subject, but I do believe that there is a pattern with Pat Buchanan of needling the Jews. Is that anti-Semitic? Yeah. I mean, after a while, you conclude it is, in some sense, anti-Semitic. I mean, Pat Buchanan obviously has a lot of personal and affectionate relationships with people who are Jewish. So on a personal level, perhaps he's not. But on a different, maybe thematic level, I think he probably is. I think that people should be allowed to have differing views on immigration. I think people should be allowed to point out the fact that there is an Israeli lobby, and yes, it's powerful, and debate the merits of that, I guess. I don't think there's, strictly speaking, anything wrong with that. But again, I think Pat Buchanan is part of the reason it's so hard to have that conversation, because he discredits it by his presence, because he gives people who watch him carefully the sense that he has another agenda that has to do with personal dislike, and that he believes in conspiracies, and that he believes that the Jews are this sinister, secretly organized force trying to affect American politics. And those aren't discussions I think normal people, sober people should be having, because I think they're ludicrous.
Okay, so that's the clip. We're done with the clips for now, so I'm going to come back to our main screen here. So the basis of his attack against Patrick Buchanan is that Buchanan is an anti-Semite. And let's flesh this out a little bit. Let's tease this out somewhat. So Tucker says, because it's a very subtle and nuanced and specific thing that Tucker is saying. Tucker says that Pat Buchanan is kooky, is hateful. He's crazy, he's an anti-Semite, and because he's an anti-Semite, he's hurting legitimate political actors. How does Tucker Carlson create that distinction? What is the essence of that distinction between these so-called legitimate critics of the Israel lobby? Because if you notice, Tucker says it is okay to attack the Israel lobby. It is okay to talk about the sovereignty of our military. And sovereignty of the military means who is sending Americans to die in wars? Is it a foreign lobby, or is it actually the will of the American people? He said, so those are legitimate conversations to have. You can criticize the lobby. You can argue whether we're going to war at the behest of Israel or not. He said, and that's legitimate. That's a legitimate conversation that we can and should have. He said, but Pat Buchanan is different. He said, Pat Buchanan is kooky and crazy, and he is an anti-Semite. Why? What is the difference? Tucker says it is the insinuation that Jewish Americans support Israel because they are Jewish. That is the essence of the distinction. And in a sense, Tucker is acting as a gatekeeper. That is effectively a description of.
And you're going to notice this if you watch people like Candace Owens, Charlie Kirk, Glenn Beck, not even Glenn Beck really. You're going to see that you're seeing this shift in conservative ink where they're saying it's okay to question the lobby and maybe we shouldn't be giving as much foreign aid. But if you question the religion itself and why they're doing it, then all of a sudden it's a major problem. And again, Nick is going to get into this.
Of a gatekeeper. When Tucker is telling his audience, this is what you are allowed to talk about, and this is what you are not allowed to talk about. That is what he said. He said, these are the conversations you can and should have, and these are the conversations that sober-minded people should not be having. He is, in effect, by definition, a gatekeeper because he controls the gate of acceptable discourse.
Exactly.
What is tolerable, what is acceptable,
what you're
on
allowed to
television,
talk
in
about.
print, who can be employed and have a job influencing the minds of Americans, and who should not.
And the entire censorship from the government, going all the way back to Twitter 1.0, all the way up to what was going on during COVID and everything else, was designed around this specifically.
Who should be fired from their positions at various newspapers and opinion magazines, who should be fired from television, who should be listened to, who should have any credibility. Tucker is acting as a gatekeeper, controlling the gate of acceptable discourse, what is legitimate and what is crazy and hateful. And the basis of that distinction as the gatekeeper, again, is Pat says it has to do with Judaism. He is relentlessly talking about Judaism, and it is the Jewishness of the neocons, which colors their bias in favor of Israel. Now, I want to read to you, this is an article from Ron Unz. Ron Unz is Jewish himself. He wrote a fantastic article about this. I would encourage everybody to read it. It is about the ascendancy of the neocons. Ron Unz writes a little summary of the situation that Tucker Carlson is referring to. Tucker says that Pat is an anti-Semite. That is based on a couple of specific quotes that Pat Buchanan made in the early 1990s. Again, and the build-up to this is that George Bush took the country to war in Iraq in 1990, and it was a coalition of what were called paleo-conservatives, Pat Buchanan among them, as well as Russell Kirk and Joseph Sobran and Sam Francis, that were in opposition to the war. So this is the summary. This is from Ron Unz. This will help give you an idea of what was happening at the time and how and why Tucker was weighing in almost 10 years later. It says, quote, this is from the Unz Review. Many leading traditional conservatives expressed very strong reservations about George Bush's Gulf War plans, while the neocons fervently supported the attack against Israel's most dangerous regional rival, Iraq. Pat Buchanan held important positions in both the Nixon and Reagan administrations, and then he was a nationally syndicated columnist with a huge television footprint on Crossfire, the McLaughlin Group, and other popular cable shows.
And a lot of people would probably remember that are older, that are 60, 70 years old, remember the McLaughlin Group and Crossfire and those shows, that Pat Buchanan was huge on those shows. Yeah, he was a hugely popular talking head on those shows.
The ADL and other Jewish groups ferociously attacked the pundit when he declared to his national television audience of millions, quote, this is Patrick Buchanan, Capitol Hill is Israeli-occupied territory. This is 35 years ago. Pat Buchanan. There are only two groups that are beating the drums for war in the Middle East: the Israeli Defense Ministry and its Amen Corner in the United States. The Israelis want this war desperately because they want the United States to destroy the Iraqi war machine. They want us to finish them off. They don't care about our relations with the Arab world. This was in 1990. This is Pat Buchanan in 1990 against the first Bush administration in the first Persian Gulf War, which happened on the Iraqi side of the Persian Gulf. Notice how prescient what he said was then, 35 years ago. That was before 9/11, before the war in Iraq, the invasion and overthrow of Saddam Hussein in 2003, before the global war on terror, before all of it, before social media. Pat Buchanan said Capitol Hill is Israeli-occupied territory. The only people that want the war, the Israeli Defense Ministry, and notably he says the Israeli Defense Ministry's Amen Corner meaning amen, people that will support the Israelis no matter what in Washington. This comment was singled out and became a national controversy. And many of the neocons, both Jews and non-Jews alike, said that when Pat Buchanan said Amen Corner, he meant Jews. Pat Buchanan was insinuating, according to the neocons, that all the Jews in Washington were supporting Israel's war, imputing their motivations, saying that American Jews are Israel first. Imagine that. The article goes on. It says some commentators contended that that latter phrase could be read to mean merely Israel's supporters. But this more benign interpretation was undermined by some of Buchanan's own columns. In one column, written within days of the Amen Corner remark, Buchanan named 4 of those that he had in mind, the Amen Corner. A.M. Rosenthal, the former Assistant Secretary of Defense Richard Pearl, the columnist Charles Krauthammer, and the former Secretary of State Henry Kissinger.
So do you remember those names? Kissinger is probably the most popular name of the group. Krauthammer was on Fox News for quite a while. If those of you who don't remember who Krauthammer was, he was in a wheelchair. He had gotten into an accident diving into a pool when he was in college. I think he died of a heart attack at least 5 years ago, maybe somewhere around there, 3 to 5 years ago. And Pearl was one of the individuals that wrote the Clean Break Memo, which I'm not going to go into tonight, but the Clean Break Memo was basically a document forcing the United States, or saying the reason why we needed to get into all these wars, the Iraq War, Syria, all these different places, Iraq, Iran, all these things that we needed to get into on behalf of Israel. But these are familiar names to most people, especially Kissinger.
The Jewishness of these names contrasted with those of the American soldiers, who, in a subsequent piece, Buchanan said would do the fighting if war came to the Gulf. He said kids with names like McAllister, Murphy, Gonzalez, and Leroy Brown will die in the war in Iraq. So, Buchanan says one day, this war is the doing of the Israeli Defense Ministry. They want America to do our bidding, and they own Capitol Hill. And the only ones that want this war in Iraq are the Israeli government and their supporters in America. Everybody says, well, what's the amen corner? That's a dog whistle for American Jews. Some people say, no, he didn't mean American Jews. He just meant like neocons in general, people that support Israel. Buchanan comes over a week later and says, no, when I'm referring to the amen corner, I mean these 4 Jews. I mean these Jewish writers and these Jewish guys that work at think tanks and the Jewish people inside the Defense Department. Those are the amen corner. Those are the only other people in addition to Israel that support the war. And Buchanan contrasted those names. He said, who supports Israel's war in Iraq? Rosenthal, Krauthammer, Pearl, and Kissinger, all Jews. He said, and who's going to die in the war? He said, Leroy Brown, McAllister, Murphy, and Gonzalez. Now, what's the implication? The implication is these Jews in America that love Israel because they're Jewish, they're pushing us into a war that benefits Israel that Americans will die in. Specifically, non-Jewish Americans that are Irish, that are white from Appalachia, that are Mexican. People with names like McAllister, Gonzalez, and Leroy Brown, they're going to die for people named Rosenthal, Kissinger, and Krauthammer. That was the comment in the early 1990s that got him attacked by the establishment. Those are the comments that Tucker Carlson was referring to. When Tucker says that Pat Buchanan is insinuating that Jews push America into wars that non-Jews are going to die in, that's the remark he was talking about. The amen corner, that's the remark he was talking about. And to Tucker, that is the line between what is acceptable and what is unacceptable. Whether you say that Jewishness and Judaism has anything to do with the neoconservatives in America, the Israel lobby in America, and Israel bringing us to war in the Middle East for their benefit. The distinction is whether you think it's all ideological or whether you think it has to do with their Jewishness, whether it's essential. That's the distinction. Now, the article from UNS goes on. It says, Pat Buchanan decided to challenge George Bush in the Republican primaries, a development that seemed likely to spark an explosive public conflict between the heavily Jewish neocons and their traditionalist conservative rivals, very much like what is happening today. William F. Buckley, Jr., who was the founder of National Review, had long reigned as the quasi-pope of the conservatives.
Now, this guy, William F. Buckley Jr., is someone who my father looked up to. Okay, so, this guy died in his 80s. These are the founding members of neoconservatism. And this is why it's so important to understand history and where all of this stuff came from, especially with Pat Buchanan, and not to single out Nick Fuentes specifically for what he says, because Pat Buchanan was saying the same thing way back when and was being attacked by people like William F. Buckley Jr. and the like for saying essentially the same thing that Nick Fuentes is saying now. And this stuff was being said 35 years ago. And think about how well this information was suppressed for decades. And now it's coming back out again. And this is why there's panic. This is why there's problems. This is why, you're seeing all of these, these attacks on Nick and all these things that are going on. Because once again, you don't judge someone based on somebody else's opinion. You judge them based on what you see yourself by watching their videos, watching them speak, listening to their ideas.
Attempted to preempt this looming conflict by publishing a book called In Search of Anti-Semitism, a massive 40,000-word article that filled an entire issue of his magazine, National Review, and was later released as a book, coming down on the side of the neocons and sharply criticizing his erstwhile allies like Buchanan and Sobran. So this was the episode, think about it, this was the episode in the 1990s. George H.W. Bush, again, from Yale College, from Skull and Bones, George Bush, the vice president from Yale, from the CIA,
they're all
who
interconnected.
became the president, brought us to war in Iraq. at the behest of the neocons. Pat Buchanan, Joseph Sobran, Sam Francis, Russell Kirk, the traditional conservatives rise up and say, this is not America first. This is a war for Israel. Capitol Hill is Israeli-occupied territory, and so is the conservative movement. And the reason they're supporting the war is because they're Jewish. Pat Buchanan challenges the incumbent president, George Bush, in 1992 in the Republican primary and almost wins in New Hampshire, gets a surprising amount of support, and threatens to fracture the movement. By serving as a spoiler in that GOP primary in 1992, Buchanan inspires Ross Perot to run as a third party. And some people blame Pat Buchanan and Ross Perot for George Bush's defeat in 1992. Does this sound similar? 8 years later, Tucker Carlson comes out and says what? It's okay to criticize neocons and their wars. It's okay to criticize the Israel lobby. It's okay to talk about the sovereignty of the military. He said what's beyond the pale is this insistence on talking about Judaism, saying that Jewish Americans have to support Israel, saying that non-Jews will die in wars that Jewish push America into. He said that is what is truly anti-Semitic. That is beyond the pale. This mirrors exactly the situation right now, which is that the Israel lobby once again is pushing us into a war in Iran. Who is Donald Trump's vice president right now? J.D. Vance. J.D. Vance, who went to Yale Law School, who is a protege of Peter Thiel, one of the CIA's most important contractors because he built Palantir. And as we talked about last week, J.D. Vance would not exist, would not have had a Senate seat, would not be Trump's vice president without Peter Thiel and actually Tucker Carlson. So just as then, George Bush, head of the CIA from Yale, vice president under Reagan, becomes president, puts us to war in Iraq, as it is now. J.D. Vance, protege of CIA contractor Peter Thiel from Yale Law School. Trump is pushing us into war with Iran at the behest of the neocons. I get up in 2024 and say, do not vote for Trump. This is Israeli-occupied territory. The only people that want a war in Iran are the Israelis in their amen corner. And just as in 1999, what does Tucker Carlson come out and say about me? He said, there are legitimate critics of the neocons like Joe Kent and Vance, but Fuentes is crazy and hateful. He is kooky and an anti-Semite. It's the same situation 30 years ago over a different war and the same monologue, canceling what is really the same figure, relatively the same figure in exactly the same way. As I said at the beginning of the show, this is a story of generations. This story, like all stories, is a story of generations, fathers and sons, and cycles and networks, and the rise and fall of nations.
Sorry, I muted my microphone. Sorry about that. But going back to what Nick Fuentes was saying is all of this stuff goes back to where Candace Owens, Tucker Carlson, all these guys, colluding with each other, attacking Nick Fuentes. But prior to that, how everyone was coming out of Yale and that professors were recruiting people for the CIA out of Yale, the Skull and Bones out of Yale. I mean, it's crazy back then from the 50s and then fast forwarding all the way to now. It's just, it's insane.
So you could say that in the 1990s, there was a different generation of this battle. There were the Paleocons and the Neocons, just as there are now. Paleocons, America Firsters, and Neocons. But I want to focus a little bit more on William F. Buckley, because as Ron Unz writes in his article, the major attack against Pat Buchanan did not come from Tucker Carlson. At that time, Tucker Carlson was a very low-level journalist, barely got on television, and was not really into public broadcasting. And his attack on Buchanan came in 1999, many years after the initial controversy in 1991. The major attack against Buchanan came from William F. Buckley, who at that time, if you understand anything about the history of the conservative movement, William F. Buckley was considered the intellectual leader of the conservative movement in America. Ron Unz calls him the quasi-pope. And it was William F. Buckley who founded National Review in the 1950s, at the beginning of the Cold War, after World War II. It was William F. Buckley that throughout the 1960s, 70s, and 80s, he is the one that really created the modern doctrine of conservatism. He was behind Barry Goldwater in 1964. He was the intellectual heavyweight behind the fusionist coalition that brought Reagan to power in 1980. So William F. Buckley was the leader of the conservatives, in many ways similar to Tucker Carlson today, or you could argue somebody like Ben Shapiro or somebody like Charlie Kirk. William F. Buckley was dominant.
I disagree with that entirely. William F. Buckley was a class of his own. Like I had said earlier, my father introduced me to conservatism through people like Pat Buchanan and William F. Buckley Jr. William F. Buckley Jr. was the guy. The guy spoke with the best way that I could describe it is he spoke with a British accent, yet he was born in the United States. It was strange, but he would have these debates with the left, and this was during the Cold War, so there was just this back and forth kind of stuff with these intellectuals, and William F. Buckley Jr. was he would lay back in his chair and just almost arrogantly just speak as if he was some British guy when he wasn't British. But he was definitely a class by himself. However, he had this guy like a Nick Fuentes with Pat Buchanan, who was sort of like nipping at his feet, I guess, for the lack of a better word, who was kind of going against everything that William Buckley was talking about. But I would say that comparing William F. Buckley Jr. to anyone today, you really can't. That's hard to do. There's really no one that I know of at this point you can compare him to.
Dominant. I would argue more dominant than any of them today back in the 1980s and 1990s.
That's right.
As I said, William F. Buckley wrote a 40,000-word hit piece on Buchanan in 1991 called In Search of Anti-Semitism, filled up a whole issue of the magazine, published as a book, and it sought to cancel Pat Buchanan and push him out of the race so that he could not challenge George Bush in 1992. Now, I want to talk about who William F. Buckley is, because when we work through the biography of William F. Buckley, we're going to discover some startling themes, some startling patterns.
This is important.
And you'll notice there's many of these patterns that show up over and over and over again in consistent themes. Before we get into William F. Buckley, it is important to talk about the CIA and where the CIA came from and how the CIA operates, what its mission is, among other things. Because again, if you go back to last week, my criticism of Tucker Carlson, the central question is Tucker Carlson in the CIA? We talked about his father. We talked about Voice of America. He accused me of being in the CIA. He attacked Pat Buchanan along the same lines that William F. Buckley did 10 years earlier. I want to talk about the CIA and establish some important things to understand about how they operate first, to understand all these stories. So where did the CIA actually come from? The CIA is established in 1947, but it was preceded by an organization called the OSS. And this was a wartime intelligence organization that was started during World War II in the aftermath of some sabotage attacks in New York City and other espionage that was happening during the war on the part of the Germans and the Axis powers that we were fighting. So the OSS forms up. That's the precursor to the CIA. It's a wartime intelligence outfit. Now, we're not going to go into all the particulars and details. There's a couple of things we need to understand about the CIA during World War II and shortly afterward at the beginning of the Cold War. In the first place, some of the most important sources, confidential sources that provided human intelligence for the OSS during World War II came through Italy. The United States invades Italy in 1943. They take over the Italian peninsula, and this is like their springboard into the European continent to fight Hitler and to fight the European Axis powers. The OSS rapidly establishes themselves inside of Italy. And one of the biggest sources of intelligence during the war for the OSS was Jewish refugees that fled Nazi-occupied territory through Italy. The Nazis occupied a vast swath of territory in Germany, in Austria, all over Northern Europe, where a lot of Jews lived. And when the Jews were fleeing Nazi captivity or persecution, they fled to Italy, where they were not going to be subjected to some of the anti-Semitic policies, and ultimately where they were liberated by the United States when the U.S. invaded and landed there. Now, the Jewish refugees fled Germany and Austria into Italy, and they provided a massive source of confidential intelligence for U.S. wartime intelligence. And you have to understand why that is. Those Jewish refugees had information about Germany, about Austria. What's more, they spoke the language. They spoke German. They spoke the lingua franca of the Nazi Empire. Also, they were hostile to the Nazi Empire, being Jews. So these Jews that were leaving Nazi Germany, these are like ready-made intelligence units because they hate the enemy, they speak the enemy's language, and they used to live on the enemy's territory. So very quickly, in the 1940s, U.S. wartime intelligence is using these Jewish refugees to get information on the Nazis. They're using Jewish refugees as intelligence agents, penetrating Nazi Germany along the border. The person that ran this intelligence operation was a guy named James Jesus Angleton. He was in charge of all of the OSS operations on the Italian peninsula, and he got in charge a little bit later, but he got there in 1943 with the rest of the Allies. And it was Angleton who was running this operation. And Angleton saw the value of these Jewish refugees as intelligence officers. They were a great asset for what would become the CIA. This is important to understand. Now, later on, of course, the Allies win World War II. We defeat Nazi Germany. And in the next 5 years after the war is won, the United States enters a Cold War with the Soviet Union. And all of a sudden, the Soviet Union becomes the primary adversary. 1947, the OSS becomes the CIA. James Angleton becomes one of the founding fathers of the CIA. And he is put in charge of being a liaison between U.S. intelligence and foreign intelligence agencies. 1948, the State of Israel is declared. They declare their independence. They fight a brief war with the Arabs. The U.S. recognizes them. And James Angleton begins liaising with Israeli intelligence as part of his job description, founding father of the CIA, running counterintelligence, and working as a liaison with our allied intel agencies. Pursuant to the emerging Cold War, the Soviet Union became our primary adversary. But there was a big problem. An Iron Curtain had descended onto Europe. The Soviets were not letting anybody leave the Soviet Union, or later on, the Warsaw Pact countries. The Soviet Union was a closed-off society. Joseph Stalin made it like a fortress. And so, in the early days of the CIA, in the early days of the Cold War, we had no knowledge of what was happening inside the Soviet Union. We had no human intelligence, no sources that were inside of Russia, and Stalin had created this impenetrable fortress. There was no way to get in. That is until the 1950s. During the 1950s, there was a major aliyah. An aliyah is when the Jewish people leave their country from the diaspora and go to Israel. There's been many waves of aliyahs over the years. I think there's 6 or 7 major aliyahs. This is when a Jew makes their pilgrimage, they leave, and they return to the Holy Land to reside in Israel. In the 1950s, there was a major aliyah of Jews. Russia had a massive Jewish population. They left the Soviet Union and went to Israel. James Angleton understood the value of Jewish refugees as an intelligence source. Just as in Italy during World War II, Austrian and German Jews were very helpful human sources to tell us secrets about Nazi Germany, and they spoke the language, and they carried out operations, and they knew about those countries in which they resided. Angleton, now running the foreign desk at the newly created CIA, he saw the value in Jewish refugees that left the Soviet Union and went to Israel. And so James Angleton began a working relationship with the Israeli intelligence agencies like Shin Bet and Mossad. And a quid pro quo relationship was established. Israel understood, just like Angleton did, the value of the intelligence that the Jews leaving Russia had for the United States. And Israel was not going to give that intelligence away for free. As the Jewish refugees left Russia and came into Israel, the Israeli intelligence agencies like Shin Bet would pick them up off the street and interview them. They would gather all the information and put them under confidence. They would gather all the information that the Russian Jewish refugees had, and they would go to their liaison from the CIA, James Angleton, and they would offer him a deal. The Israeli intelligence agencies would say, if you give us American intelligence on our adversaries, like Egypt and Syria, if you give us intelligence on nuclear weapons, then we will give you the intelligence from our Jewish refugees that left Russia. That was the quid pro quo relationship that went from the 1950s until Angleton left the Israel desk in the early 1970s.
Do you see now how far back this all goes? Do you see now how far back the relationship between the intelligence agencies and Israel goes? All the way back to the 50s. And earlier, actually, to the 40s. Right after the World War II. So, yeah, and the Kennedy thing, that's for a different video, or that's for a different live stream. But there's obviously an interconnection there. But what people have to understand is the complexity and the history of all of this stuff. And what's frustrating is that if you just look at it from a surface, 50,000 foot view, it's always going to be, TPUSA or Candace Owens, Charlie Kirk, Glenn Beck, these people that are telling you what's going on. But in reality, there's a lot more going on behind the scenes. And if you question anything, and if you say, hey, look behind the curtain, and, there's this stuff going on, which originated all the way back in the 40s, you're considered an anti-Semite. This is the problem with America now. And this is what, luckily for, who knows what will happen to YouTube, and, at least with Rumble and some of these other platforms, is not as much censorship. But overall, these things, they are doing everything they possibly can, especially the ADL. lately, if you watch the Anti-Defamation League and what's going on, and these are the things that I'm going to start doing more stories about, the ADL is a full court press right now trying to get laws passed for you not to say anything about Judaism, Israel, anything at all. And one thing that you have to remember is very, very clear. They don't silence you if you're lying. They only silence you if you're telling the truth. That is one of the most important things to remember. And if we want to change things, if we want to make our lives better as Americans, we have to figure out why it is that our lives are difficult right now. Why are we being treated the way that we're being treated? Why are we being taxed the way that we're being taxed? Why are we sending our tax money to countries where it doesn't benefit us at all? Why? We have to dig down and figure out why that is.
So from the very beginning, from the 40s, during the time of the OSS in World War II, through to the beginning and the height of the Cold War and the time of the CIA, you have to understand that U.S. intelligence and Israeli intelligence, in particular Jewish refugees, were inextricably connected. So much so, many people talk about the assassination of John F. Kennedy and the role of the CIA in it. People point to James Angleton.
Rose,
James
there you
Angleton
go.
managed a team of hundreds of people with a black budget. Many of them oversaw the handling of John F. Kennedy's assassin, Lee Harvey Oswald. The people that opened Lee Harvey Oswald's mail and read it, the people that met with him in real life, they were Jewish. They were Jewish refugees from Russia. And they were a part of Angleton's hand-picked team working with a black budget, liaising with the state of Israel. The CIA and Israeli intelligence from the jump were intertwined like this. And the reason for this is not hard to understand. This is another thing to comprehend about the CIA before we get into William F. Buckley. James Jesus Angleton was not Jewish. He was American. He came from Idaho. And you might say, was he Jewish? Was he secretly Jewish? What was the motivation? It was pretty simple. James Angleton was a virulent and fierce anti-communist.
Anti-communism.
He would do anything to fight.
This is the other thing too, which is bizarre considering what's going on now. The whole point of the CIA, the whole point of intelligence, the Red Scare, everything that Nick is going to get into, is that back in the day, in the 40s, 50s, and 60s, we were obviously anti-communist. We would do anything and everything we possibly could to spread communism, or to prevent the spread of communism. And so this is what's strange now today, because it seems communism is everywhere and communism is sort of taking over. And I guess maybe it's because a lot of these people from back then are dying off and whatever, and there's different priorities, but yeah, the whole idea of intelligence after World War II was to fight against communism, and that's what makes all of this stuff so important.
The Soviet Union. And in the 1950s, when we had no idea what was happening in Russia, he would do anything to get his hands on intelligence about Russia and about the Soviet Union, even if it meant working with the Israelis, even if it meant giving the Israelis classified information about nuclear weapons. What's more, James Angleton saw Israel as an ally against the Soviet Union in the Middle East. After 1955, Egypt and Syria were armed by the Soviet Union. They received weapons, tanks, planes, and over the 50s, 60s, and 70s, moved further and further into the orbit of the Soviet Union. And on the great chessboard of communism versus capitalism during the Cold War, the CIA and the Defense Department, all these different anti-communists, they saw Israel as a bulwark against Soviet communist influence in the Middle East. So that was the basis of their cooperation. Just like in World War II, they wanted to defeat the Nazis so that the United States could liberate Europe. During the Cold War, they wanted to defeat the Soviet Union. That's why they backed Israel and used Jews as an intelligence agency, effectively.
Guys, do me a favor, interruption to advertise. Do me a huge favor, click the like button. It helps the algorithm. It helps, get more people to watch. If you wouldn't mind, also share the streams. If you're on YouTube, please share this with other people that you know. If you're on Rumble, please share this with other people that you know as well. It really helps. Also, please, biggest thing is become members of our local channel, DennisHendrickson.locals.com. You can find that link in the description, and Substack, DennisHendrickson.substack.com. You can join those two things for free. It's where I give more content that I don't put on YouTube and Rumble. Substack is where I write articles, and Locals is where I'll do more off the cuff kind of live streams. So you can join there for free, but please do me a huge favor, click the like button, share the stream. And also, it helps when you give super chats. It helps when you give Rumble rants, things like that. We are trying to create more content, spend more time on creating more content, but of course it costs money. There's things that we have to buy, equipment, all that kind of stuff. So help us out if you wouldn't mind. If you think that this content is valuable, I appreciate it.
Something else was created in the 1950s. This is the last thing we need to establish about the CIA before we get into William F. Buckley. What the CIA was really worried about in the 1950s was the ideological battle that the communists were waging on America. Because in addition to the Cold War being an arms race, a space race, being fought in proxy wars in Asia, Latin America, and in the Middle East, it was also an ideological battle. And in the same way that the Soviet Union was providing weapons and building nuclear weapons and doing all of these conventional or non-conventional military activities, the Soviet Union was also supporting an international communist element. They were backing communist political parties. They were backing communist book clubs, campus organizations, backing communist intellectuals. And if you know anything about the Red Scare, which happened in the 20s and then again in the 50s, and really was in place throughout the duration of the existence of the Soviet Union, the U.S. government and CIA, first the FBI, then the CIA, were very concerned about communist and Soviet penetration of American society through the use of spies, double agents, pushing communist ideology. So just like the Soviets, the CIA also engaged in an information ideological war. The Soviets gave weapons, the CIA gave weapons. The Soviets fought proxy wars, so did the CIA. The Soviets developed a space program for the purpose of missiles, so did the CIA with Project Paperclip. And just like the Soviet Union had communist ideological allies all across the world, so did the CIA. In the 1950s, the CIA backed a program called the Congress for Cultural Freedom. And I'll read this blurb about it. This is from Wikipedia. It says, in 1950, a group of intellectuals founded an organization called the Congress for Cultural Freedom with the aim of consolidating an anti-totalitarian intellectual community around the globe. The CCF's connections with the United States CIA were definitively established 16 and 17 years later in reports by the New York Times and Ramparts magazine, respectively. They claimed that the CIA, operating through a series of dummy foundations, had been instrumental in organizing and funding the CCF. Two people who were critical at the very beginning, and this will be important later, are Irving Kristol and James Burnham. They were both there in Berlin, in West Germany, at the founding of the CCF. Congress for Cultural Freedom in the 50s and 60s claimed to be an organization of pro-freedom intellectuals, many of them liberal. Many of them were left-wing or center-left liberal. And the claim of the Congress for Cultural Freedom is that they were leftists or liberals against radicalism, against communism. Some of them were even Trotskyites, but they were against Stalinism and against the Soviet Union. Some of the biggest names in the conservative movement in the 50s and 60s. Some of the biggest magazines with the conservative or even liberal ideological orientation in the 50s and 60s received money from the Congress for Cultural Freedoms. Many names you'd recognize were involved with this group. And throughout those 2 decades, Nobody knew that the entire time this outfit, which was providing seed money for magazines, radio stations, TV stations, books, book clubs, you name it, it was receiving money from the CIA the entire time. Many of the constituent projects did not even know about the connection. The Congress would provide money for a small magazine. They'd provide a grant for an intellectual. And the recipients of these grants themselves, in some cases, did not even know that ultimately the money came from the CIA. That was revealed many years later. So this is important to understand about how intelligence in America operates. Again,
And, when you look at this, it's not a bad thing. The CIA was trying to do everything they could to make sure that the country did not become communist. So they were funding organizations and publications and magazines at the time to counter anything that was communist. So it's hard to argue that that was a bad thing, considering I think all of us that are here that are watching this think that, communism is not good. Communism is a bad thing. There are people that will sit here and argue and say, well, communism works and all that shit, but we all know that that's not the case. So initially, when you look at this from decades ago, it didn't seem all that bad. But today, not so much.
World War II and the Cold War, they're relying upon Jewish refugees. They see Israel as a bulwark against communism. The CIA, even the elements that are not Jewish, or even necessarily sympathetic to Israel because it is Jewish, they were very pro-Jewish because of what they believed they could gain in their fight against the Soviet Union with the organized Jewish community in the world and with the state of Israel. And then, and aside from that, the CIA is fighting an ideological battle against totalitarianism, against Stalinism. And so they're backing a lot of conservative intellectuals, liberal and conservative, that are saying, even if they're not conservative, they're against radicalism. They're against the turn of the American left to full-fledged socialism and communism. And that is so that they could fortify American democracy and democracy even in Europe. Now we got to get into William F. Buckley, understanding these things. So William F. Buckley is the head of National Review, criticizing Patrick Buchanan in 1991. But where does William F. Buckley come from? I'll read to you a little bit from his bio. William F. Buckley enrolled at Yale University after World War II. Very important that he was from Yale. He joined the Skull and Bones Secret Society. If you recall, so did George H.W. Bush about a year before he did, and so did other prominent people too.
By the way, Nick hasn't mentioned this already, George H.W. Bush was CIA as well. So this is extremely important. Yeah, Yale, Skull and Bones, CIA.
He edited the Yale Daily News, a student newspaper. In 1951, he was recruited into the CIA and worked with E. Howard Hunt in Mexico City, where his father had an oil company. While with the CIA, he published a book called God and Man at Yale, The Superstitions of Academic Freedom. Later, he left the CIA and became editor of the American Mercury. He continued to be active in right-wing politics. In 1953, he established the Intercollegiate Society of Individualists. So he's at Yale University after the war. He's recruited by one of his professors into the CIA. He allegedly leaves the CIA, and then he forms up this group called ISI, Intercollegiate Society of Individuals, which was created to counter a group of the same acronym of a similar name that was formed up by communists to support socialism. Then, in 1955, he hits his big break. He founds National Review with Leo Bazell. The early senior cadres of the journal included Yale professor Wilmore Kendall, who, as the chief CIA recruiter at Yale, was responsible for recruiting William F. Buckley into the CIA. It also included James Burnham, who was working for the OSS during World War II and was active in the Congress for Cultural Freedom. He was also reputed to have had a hand in the successful plan to overthrow Iran's Mossadegh and install the Shah in 1953. Also on the original board was William Rusher, formerly a hard right captain in Army military intelligence. Marvin Lieberman met William F. Buckley in the 1950s and also helped to found the National Review. He was active in CIA projects internationally, including the Committee for a Free Asia, the World Anti-Communist League, and the American Chilean Council. Another OSS officer, William Casey, drew up the legal documents for the National Review. So William F. Buckley is at Yale. He gets recruited to the CIA by his professor, Wilmore Kendall. Then, after allegedly leaving the CIA, he forms up a Society for Free Market Individualists, a campus group, then starts up the National Review with no fewer than 5 former OSS or former CIA officers, including his professor that recruited him into the CIA, who was the head recruiter of the CIA at Yale, including James Burnham, who was at the founding of the Congress for Cultural Freedom.
Isn't it amazing how, when you look back at all of these things and how they get created, and you wonder, like, why is it so hard for me to create something or create a business or create a publication? You know, I look at Dave Portnoy, for example. How does Dave Portnoy have Barstool Sports as popular as it is? It makes you wonder. You know, and then you look at all of these, the National Review, like, how did all of these things get started? It's just sort of out of the blue. Like, you know, these guys just get money from out of nowhere, and all of a sudden these things become popular. And then you bang your head against the wall yourself and wonder, why can't I get ahead? And a lot of this stuff is fixed, ladies and gentlemen. And it started all the way back, you know, I mean, back in the 1800s, early 1900s, you know, if you were a hardworking person, you can create a company. And based on your hard work, your knowledge, and everything else, you could actually make a living. Today, it's all in who you know and who you're associated with. You're either in the club or you're not in the club. And the rest of us, you know, George Carlin said it perfectly. You know, if you're not in the club, you know, we're not in it. We're not in that club. And these are the things, is kind of oversimplifying what Nick is saying here. But, you know, it's true to a certain extent. Like, think that the skids are greased for certain people and those who know or are connected. And he'll go into this even more. I'm not going to go on, you know, pretty much past 9:30. We're going to break this up into maybe a second half or into thirds. So we'll continue a little while longer, but there's a lot more that we have to get through.
So it is obvious from the very beginning that William F. Buckley has a very similar story to Tucker Carlson. He's at an Ivy League university in New England, like Tucker Carlson. He's recruited by a professor to form up a student newspaper, write a conservative book against the communists, and to start up National Review, a publication that he had the help in founding with 5 other CIA officers, including ones that were involved in the Congress for Cultural Freedom, which was providing grants and money on behalf of the CIA to anti-communist projects. This is William F. Buckley. But he wasn't the only one to attack Patrick Buchanan. What is the basis of attacking Patrick Buchanan in the 1990s? Tucker Carlson then, just like now, and even William F. Buckley too, they said the problem with Pat Buchanan is that there is a legitimate fight against certain neocons. William F. Buckley eventually endorsed Pat Buchanan. Tucker Carlson considers himself an adversary of the neocons. They said the problem with Pat Buchanan and people like me is not that we're working for the neocons. It's not that we're the enemy. The subtle critique by Buckley and Carlson, 2 creatures of the CIA, is that both of us are hurting the real battle against the neocons. And they take issue with the fact that me and Pat Buchanan did not treat this as an ideological phenomenon, but as a Jewish phenomenon, as an ethnic or religious phenomenon. It's important to establish now who the neocons even are. if that is the battle between the America Firsters and the neocons, if we can all agree on that, but there is a battle within America First about who's really fighting the neocons, and we look at who's on either side of that battle, it's William F. Buckley and Tucker Carlson against Pat Buchanan and Nick Fuentes. It's Buckley at Yale, recruited in the CIA, founded National Review with the CIA, Tucker Carlson with his dad running Voice of America, against Pat Buchanan and Nick Fuentes, the cranks, the crazies, the anti-Semites. Well, it might help elucidate who the real enemy of the neocons are to take a look at the neocons themselves. This is a blurb from Ron Unz talking about the neocons.
Okay, I'm going to stop it there. 9:30. I'm going to go into this, or we'll continue this on Tuesday night. So we're going to do Sunday, Tuesday, Thursday. And, you know, because there's quite a bit more to go through. So those of you that are here, do me a huge favor. Click the like button before you go. Make sure that you subscribe. Those of you that are on right now on YouTube, those of you that are on Rumble right now, be sure that you subscribe to the channel to make sure that when I do notify you that we're going live, that you get that notification. And also, in the description of both Rumble and YouTube, join the locals and the Substack. And you can do it for free. So when you join all of those things, you're going to get free content there outside of the Rumble and the YouTube. Okay. And then, of course, X is there. If you're on to X, I do Spaces. If you're unfamiliar with Spaces, that's a great place to get content there too. So please be sure that you click the like button. Be sure, if you're here right now, subscribe. And we're going to continue this on Tuesday and go into the locals and the Substack, become members there, become subscribers also of YouTube and Rumble. I greatly appreciate it. Have a great rest of the night, and we'll see you all on Tuesday.